In the Weekdays with Bernie segment tonight, one of the big campaign scandals you may remember in 2004 was Dan Rather's report. It said President Bush got favorable treatment from the National Guard and thereby avoided going to Vietnam. You may remember that Mr. Rather quit under pressure after the sources for that report proved to be bogus. Now, Fox News analyst Bernie Goldberg says there's even more to the scandal than we've known. Bernie joins us now from North Carolina. All right, so I don't want to step on your exclusive here. What did you discover?
All right. Let me mention that literally just a few minutes ago at 8 o'clock straight up, I posted what I discovered on my website at bernardgoldberg.com. And I'll bet you it's about a lost crucial fact in the so-called RatherGate scandal that I'll bet you, Bill, you didn't know about.
I didn't know about.
I didn't know about.
Right.
And I'll bet you that 99.99999% of the people at home didn't know about. So first, a short background. On September 8th, 2004, just 55 days before a very close presidential election, Dan Rather and his producer Mary Mapes went on the air on the weekday edition of 60 Minutes with a story that said George W. Bush, back in the 60s, joined the Air National Guard to get out of going to Vietnam, to avoid going to Vietnam. That he got in because his daddy was a big shot, a congressman from Houston, a U.S. congressman from Houston, that he was a slacker. And in the minds of some people who saw the story, who spoke to me, it was worse than that he was a draft dodger and a coward. That's open to interpretation. Rather used what he called never-before-seen documents to back up his story. We all know about the documents. 10 seconds after they were on the air, people said they were phony, they were frauds. But the entire debate, Bill, from that point on, has been about the documents. Were they forgeries or not? Well, just the other day, I get a phone call from, let's call it a deep throat type of tip that says, go to the CBS investigation of this, which is open to anybody. Anybody can get it. And turn to page 130. That's it. I go to the document, page 130, and I find something, and I can't believe what I'm reading. Don't forget, the story is about how George W. Bush tried to avoid going to Vietnam by joining the Air National Guard. Well, on page 130, it says, without any hemming and hawing, it says, Mary Mapes, Dan Rather's producer, knew in advance of putting the story on the air that George Bush volunteered to go to Vietnam and fly combat missions. And it wasn't just one person that told her. It was more than one. It was several people. I immediately called two people who used to work at CBS, intimately involved in the story. Both said, what? I didn't know anything about this. We did an online check. Not one news story on the news pages about it, not one network news story about it, but there were two opinion pieces that made the most fleeting, passing
when did
reference
President
to
Bush volunteer to go to Vietnam?
Sometime in either late 1969 or a little after that.
And why didn't the Air Guard send him?
Because he didn't have enough flying hours. Now, if the central point, he didn't have enough flying hours, so he wouldn't qualify. So the central point of the piece is that he tried to avoid service in Vietnam.
Right. And if he volunteered, the whole thing goes up in smoke.
And she didn't. That's right. And she didn't share it with us.
I know enough about the story that there was a time when President Bush, while he was in the Air Guard, said, I do not volunteer to go to Vietnam.
That's right. And that's in my story at bernardgoldberg.com. And then he had an explanation for that. But what I say is, whatever the interpretation of, at one point he said he didn't want to go overseas, at another point he did. Whatever interpretation you put to that seeming contradiction, if at any point the producer knew that he volunteered to go,
yeah, you gotta
she had an obligation to put that in the story. And she didn't. Now, my question is, we know that she didn't share it with the audience. Did she share it with her correspondent, Dan Rather? Or to put it another way, Bill, what did Dan know, and when did he know it?
Now, do you know why President Bush contradicted himself and one time said, I do want to go, and then I don't want to go?
There was a statement that he gave the Washington Post in July of 1999 that said, look, I didn't want to go to Vietnam in the infantry. I readily admit that. I joined the Air National Guard because I wanted to fly. He told the Washington Post, if my unit was called, I would go. And then his office, he was governor at the time, his office said, and you should read it on my website, but his office said, look, he volunteered for a specific job with the Air National Guard. It would have been improper for him to say, I'm going to the Air National Guard. I also don't want to go overseas. It is a complex thing. But as I say, however you interpret it, if she knew that at any point he volunteered, she had an obligation to say it. Let me say one other thing very, very quickly. You could make a case that he volunteered. I'm not making this case, that he volunteered knowing he would never be allowed to go. But if Mary Mapes felt that was true, she had an obligation to say he volunteered.
If you want to do a fair and balanced report, you have to report everything on the record and let the audience
put on a credible person who says it was a sham.
All right, so next time we see Dan Rather, we'll ask him, did you know about this deal that he volunteered to Vietnam?
Good luck, Bill.
Hey, we could find him, Bernie. You know us. All right, Bernie Goldberg, everybody go to his